Welcome to another episode of Headlines in History with your host, John Malik. Now, it looks like we are on episode 14. And again, like I had said, we are going to have another interview today. Another lieutenant colonel in the military intelligence field. Today, it's going to be Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Totter. Colonel Totter is someone that I've known for years now. Has deployment experience, works full-time with the New York Army National Guard in a pretty interesting capacity. He is currently the J2 for Joint Task Force Empire Shield, which we're going to get into. But in relation to this podcast, we're going to talk about his experience in Iraq and when he joined the Army and what his responsibilities were when he got to southern Iraq, Basra in particular, how he was the OIC for an intelligence team there, what his responsibilities were, and what he thinks is happening in Iraq today and going forward. It's really going to be an interesting episode. So as we always say, weekly caveat, although we remain in the business, we do not speak for the U.S. government, the United States Army, the National Guard, the DoD. Anything we say is based on our opinions alone. Okay, so thanks for joining in this week. Sit down, buckle in, and join me for a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Totter. All right, Colonel Totter, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. As you heard just in the intro, I did a little bit of an introduction into Colonel Totter and his experience and his background, but I'll let him speak for himself a little bit. So let's go back to the beginning. Why are you in the Army? Why are you here today?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on, John. You and I always have great discussions, vigorous discussions, and it's a pleasure to be on. I guess of most interest to your audience, I joined the Army in 2006, originally enlisted infantry. This was at the height of the Iraq War in terms of the surge that was going on. And pretty much from there, I was in college at the time that I enlisted and ended up within a couple of years commissioning as an officer. So to take that forward to 2009, of the branches that were available for me to commission into, military intelligence sounded the most interesting, so I ended up going ahead with that, and the rest is history. I've been in now 18 years and had a variety of intelligence positions, and it's been a great experience for me to go parallel alongside my civilian career.
Yeah, speaking of which, what you have I wouldn't say it's necessarily unique, but it is certainly a pretty big challenge in your civilian career. What is it that you do on the civilian side?
On the civilian side, I'm an attorney, and also I wear another hat as a real estate investor as well. And the attorney experience really grew out of a lifelong desire to become an attorney. I really didn't originally see myself as being a military officer. That was kind of something that evolved along the way, but I always wanted to be an attorney. So that was something that I pursued throughout being enlisted, throughout becoming an officer. I was deployed to Iraq in the middle of my law school experience. I did my first year of law school, deployed, came back, did my second and third year, and then passed the bar exam. So it's been something that I had always wanted to do and something that resonates deeply with me.
What type of law was your favorite when you were in school? Even if you may not even practice it, but like, what did you love?
Yeah, this is interesting because you obviously have extensive experience in dealing with prosecutors, but the one that was the most enjoyable for me, the most definitely invigorating was being an intern for a defense attorney. And it was a little niche defense attorney firm that mostly worked with La Cosa Nostra type defendants, and not many of them successful, but it gave me great experience, and it was fun. There's no other way to describe it. It was really fun, despite the fact that a lot of these cases didn't stand a serious chance in court, but it gave me great experience, great insight. I didn't want to become a defense attorney. It was just what was open to me at the time in terms of internships. I had just gotten back from Iraq, but man, what a fun experience.
So did you sit in I assume you sat in some trials even, or grand jury, like what did you, and did you get to experience live, like how the prosecutors brought a strong case and you were like, uh-oh, we're not going to have much much to say here.
Oh yeah, I did a little bit of that, but mostly meetings with clients and doing proffer agreements.
Yeah.
And that's just, when you sit through that, you get a really close insider view of what it's like from the defendant's side and how things like plea agreements are presented by the defense attorney, the type of negotiation that goes back and forth. And I did do internships for the U.S. Attorney's Office and other things on the more prosecutorial side. But getting to see what goes through the rationale between deciding to go ahead to trial or to go to take a plea deal was just an enormously insightful experience.
Yeah. So me working in the as you said, the prosecution side of the house as an organized crime investigator for so long, I clearly was not involved in attorney-client discussions on the defense side for obvious reasons, but it did certainly seem, from my perspective on the other side of the table, that when dealing with defendants and their attorneys, the strategy wasn't so much how do we prove to a jury that we're not guilty. It's what's the best deal we can get here, and what's the fewest amount of years I can spend in prison, because just so many of the times I dealt with people, they were guilty.
Right.
So the strategy wasn't like, no, I didn't do it, and here's how I have to make sure I explain why I didn't do it. No, you did it. It's like, what? How do you want to get the deal? And interesting that you bring up the defense thing. I remember one time in my office, we did end up arresting somebody out of a grand jury indictment. So there was certainly information, or there was certainly evidence we had for probable cause for the warrant. But it turned out that this defendant was not guilty. And in fact, there was mistakes made, and the person that we had thought we saw was not the person we saw. But it was so evident after we had sat down with his defense attorney and sat down at the table and started having discussions, his demeanor and behavior and his defense attorney's behavior was so different than everybody else's. It was clear to us, no, the guy really didn't do it.
Right.
But all of the other people sat at the table, and within 3 minutes, we're like, okay, the guy did it.
Sure.
And of course, they all get their day in court and all of those things, But and I'm certainly making an allegation here, right? Technically, but anyway, so it must have been really interesting on your side of the house for sure. But so, are you one of the special smart guys who passed the bar the first time?
I did pass the bar on the first time, and I had a very similar experience to, I think, a lot of attorneys who took the New York State Bar, which is that you walk out of the bar exam feeling like you definitely failed the exam, and there's not a chance in the world, and then the score comes back months later, and you passed, and you're elated. It's an amazing feeling, and then you can begin, after you've been admitted to the bar, actually practicing law.
We had Colonel Sean Tabankin on the show a couple of weeks ago, based on his experience in the Horn of Africa, and it was really interesting. But he's also an attorney. Have you spoken to him at all from a lawyer to lawyer perspective? Meaning, maybe you kind of just discussed your histories and the differences in his civilian career as an attorney and yours, or any of those things. Have you done that?
No, we haven't. But I've always been pretty amazed by the number of attorneys that there are in the military who are not practicing military law. I have always thought that's a really interesting aspect of being a National Guardsman, is that you do something on the civilian side, and it not only is unrelated to what you're doing on the military side, but in certain ways it also makes it just a better experience for you. You take certain things that you learn from the civilian side that you wouldn't ordinarily think apply to military intelligence, or whatever career field the attorney happens to be in, and it's applicable, and it just deepens your experience. It deepens your knowledge of how things work and how the world works, and maybe how you interact with logic and how you're able to suspend disbelief for certain problem sets. And yeah, that's always surprised me. And I've met many people in the National Guard in the last 18 years who had a very similar experience to mine.
Let's talk a little bit about your other civilian experience, and that's with real estate. And this is a whole world that I don't understand. And we've discussed real estate in the past, and there's just so much to learn. But it's fascinating to me because it seems that there's in some ways there's a lot of risk, financial risk involved in real estate, but at the same time, it's also one of those steady standard investments in a sense, right? It's not like playing the market.
Sure.
People often say that if you're going to do something for the long term in terms of investment, get into real estate, right? Real estate will always have value. It's just where the value is, I guess. So what is your area in terms of real estate? What do you enjoy doing? How long you been doing it? Just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I started off pretty small. I started with a townhome that a friend of a friend had recommended the property manager for. They happened to be selling this unit, so that was an extremely small way to start off, but it was a really good way in the long run to get started because I was able to, with relatively low risk, learn the business, learn how the analytics work, learn how to mitigate risk. Like you said, that's one of the biggest parts of this, right? Is you're still dealing with an investment that has risk. And if you can learn how to mitigate that risk and still continue to grow, you inherit a new set of challenges, but at the same time, you can really make this something that's dependable, something that's sustainable, long-lasting. So many people get into investing just generally, whether that's, playing around with stocks or, buying a rental property, and, they have no idea how to mitigate risk. And that was something that my experience in the law and also experience as a military intelligence officer ended up helping me with. So I started off small with a townhome and then kind of built up from there, always with the goal of keeping everything relatively passive. There's no such thing, I believe, in real estate as a truly passive experience, unless you're going to be maybe a limited partner on a syndication deal or something of that nature. Most of it is somewhat passive, but you do have a little bit of an active role. I've tried to keep all of my investments relatively passive. So you work with a property manager, you're not dealing with phone calls at 2 a.m. from tenants. And that's really what scares a lot of people away from real estate investing is, they're scared that it's going to be something that takes over their life. For me, being a busy family man, being a busy, National Guardsman, having, at different times a full-time civilian career, that's intimidating. You don't want something that's going to be able to, take over your whole life. And that is also why it was important for me to scale and to start off small and then build from there. And it's really taken off in a big way. Again, mostly passive, but the parts that are active are also fun as well. So learning how to scale, learning how to finance, learning how to select a property, it all comes down to analytics, which is something that you learn in military intelligence, how to analyze a problem set and still come to the best outcome.
So when did you really get after it? Meaning, when did you really start to invest your time and some obvious money in real estate? I mean, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, like when did you start?
No, yeah, this all started maybe 6 years ago with the first property, and then scaling from there in a big way happened within the last 3 years, so really post-COVID. The waters of the real estate market go up and down. There's opportunities to jump in, but in general, the expression holds true that it's not timing the market, it's time in the market. So my best investments have been things that I invested in at the start because they've had time to appreciate. You have time to learn how to handle those properties and how to deal with their unique qualities. And so over time, those properties that you've held the longest continue to grow in value. And then the key is really to find a model that works and to continue to build off of that, continue to mitigate risk, continue to find something that's sustainable.
Do you work with partners, or are you kind of working on alone? How does that work?
There's no real way to do it, I've found, without partners, unless you're going to turn it into a full-time job. So, we work through operators for the property management side of the house, people who handle the placement of tenants and handle the phone calls and dealing with tenants one-on-one. I work with partners on the acquisition side, so I use a virtual assistant who contacts these property owners and is able to have conversations with them and present offers, and that ultimately come before me as to whether to accept or decline. You have partners that you work with as well on the funding side of the house, so you'll have private lenders or people who are interested in getting in passively into your deals, and so it's all enabled by various partners.
Okay, so we talked about your education. Obviously, you have a lawyer, you have a law background, I should say, and you're doing real estate on the side. But what is it that let's talk about the military side. So for those that are listening, as you recall, we're National Guard members, so we have our part-time National Guard job, and then we have our full-time civilian career. But there are people like myself who are involved that have their part-time job, their 1 week in a month job, and then they have their full-time Army job. Some people are in that, and it just so happens that Colonel Totter's in that position as well. So what is it that you do? We know you do military intelligence on the weekends. What is it that you do full-time for the Army?
Yeah, full-time right now, I'm on orders for a mission called Joint Task Force Empire Shield. And if you've ever traveled into New York City and you've seen Penn Station or some of the airports and you notice armed National Guardsmen standing watch over those locations for purposes of anti-terrorism, that is Joint Task Force Empire Shield by and large. So it's a very unique mission protecting not only New York City, but other locations in New York State from acts of terrorism. It evolved out of September 11th and the attacks that happened on that day. And it continues to be an enduring mission. It continues to be used for other things too, such as responding to natural disasters. And it's really a standing force that's able to be flexibly used by the governor to address any sort of security needs that come up from the state. And it's a very, very unique mission. I can't state that strongly enough. There's just nothing like it that you can really do in any other area of the military. I mean, imagine the security problem set that's posed by a place like Grand Central Station or Penn Station, if you're familiar with either of those locations. I mean, just labyrinths of tunnels and passageways and mezzanines and just a very complex security environment. And then you just level on top of that the size of the city, the complex problems that the city deals with, and then you put armed National Guard soldiers in those locations. And it's amazing, but they continue day after day, year after year to provide security to the city and to the state and to do it really well.
So what is your role in that mission?
So I'm the intelligence officer for that mission. So I run a very small intelligence shop. It's called J2, obviously referring to the staff position of an intelligence officer in the Army staff structure. And essentially, it's my job to let the commander know where the risks are, and that will influence operations. But also, we have a very unique role in that we reach down to the lowest ground level as well.
Is this something that's only in New York? Like, does every state have this program?
No, yeah, every state has a capability of bringing on soldiers for state active duty. But to my knowledge, this is the longest lasting and the largest state active duty mission in the nation. So it's very unique in that sense as well.
Right, so there isn't, say, Empire Shield soldiers in North Carolina or Maine, right?
No.
Empire Shield stuff is, hence the name, right? This is a New York State function and a New York State mission.
It is, and it is recognized around the country as being very unique. Other states look to it to see and compare about bringing on soldiers onto their own state active duty missions, but this is something that evolved out of the unique problem set of September 11th and the continued threats that come from terror.
So I would say, you mentioned some pretty big and popular locations in the city, but NYPD is a big organization as well. So you're not doing this alone. How does that work between Empire Shield and the regular law enforcement that's doing similar work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Empire Shield is partnered along with the police organizations that are in the city to provide that protection. So we have a saying, where there's no blue, there's no green, meaning that where there's not a police officer presence, we generally will not have a military presence as well. But where there are police officers and we are asked to provide partnership, for example, Port Authority Police Department patrolling in some of the subways or some of the transit hubs, that will be an opportunity for Empire Shield to also go alongside in partnership with them.
So this is, we keep talking about the Army, but this is not a United States Army mission. This is a New York State mission that uses soldiers in a state capacity. Right?
That's correct. This is a joint mission. So we have soldiers, airmen, naval reservists, and all working in partnership together. And that goes for the lowest level all the way up to the staff as well.
So what does a typical day look like for you as the senior intelligence officer for a mission like that? Like, you get up, you go to work. What does that look like?
We have to rely greatly on our intelligence partners that are working with us domestically to provide that intelligence. Really, it's a lot of law enforcement intelligence for the most part. So we have to go out and make sure that we get the best information possible to bring back to the soldiers. So the day-to-day depends on what meetings are available, what synchronization opportunities are available for us, and it can vary greatly based on location. So I can be in one part of the city on one day attending a meeting or be back at headquarters a completely different day. And it really depends on the day. There's a little bit of a rhythm that you start to develop as you continue to work through the different schedules of the law enforcement agencies. But in general, it just depends on where the best meetings are taking place and where the best information is.
Okay, what about on the part-time side of the house? So when you're not protecting New York City and helping soldiers and airmen do that mission, when you do your one weekend a month, what are you doing there?
So I am the intelligence branch chief for the New York Army National Guard. And also I play a role as a senior intelligence mentor to the 42nd Infantry Division as they prepare for their deployment. And both of those opportunities give a chance for me to give back some of the intelligence experience that I've built over the years to soldiers and officers in the military who are involved in unique roles and maybe to a certain extent feel a little bit isolated in the state. They may be in a unit where there's not a lot of intelligence support, maybe not a lot of intelligence soldiers, and they can reach out to get advice and consultation and resources and training, and it really gives a good opportunity to help people who are in the same position that I was in only 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah. So let's talk about some interesting history stuff. So you mentioned a deployment to Iraq in particular. I don't remember exactly. I think 2006 maybe it was?
2009.
2009 you went? Okay. So talk to me a little bit about that experience. How did that come about? What unit were you in at the time? What position did you fill? And what was that experience like?
So in 2009, I joined the 501st EOD, which stands for Explosive Ordnance Disposal. And they're commonly known in civilian parlance as the bomb techs, right? These are the people who interact with roadside bombs and get called up and wear the big EOD suit that's seen in so many movies. And I joined them in 2009 and ended up deploying with them in 2010 through 2011 to Iraq. We were located in Basra, and we filled the role as Task Force Troy South, and that was the EOD component for Iraq that covered the southern part of the country. So managing explosive ordnance disposal teams located throughout the southern portion of Iraq.
And you say southern Iraq, where specifically?
Our headquarters was located out of Basra, but we controlled EOD teams pretty much south of Baghdad.
Oh, wow. And so what was your position there, and what was the day-to-day like in such a crazy place and a crazy time?
I played two roles during that time. One was as the local battalion S2, so that would be the local intelligence officer for our battalion, and that would really involve more mundane aspects of making sure that we were doing the right things for our battalion and taking care of the intelligence needs of them. But then also, we would have a unique role with the division that was located there, and that was the 36th Infantry Division out of Texas. And we would provide, as the intelligence section for the local EOD battalion, EOD-related intelligence information to that division. And what that looked like on a daily basis was there would be a roadside bomb attack that would go off, and we would be integrated with the EOD soldiers to provide information about that attack to the division and let them know what lessons could be learned from that, what kind of trends we were seeing, so that we could ultimately mitigate suffering and save the lives of the soldiers that were out on those patrols.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the story of the Iraq deployment, at least probably from a tactical perspective, not so much the strategic perspective, but the IED. I mean, that's the thing that killed so many soldiers, and there's so many different styles of IEDs, right? I mean, some are just wired 155 rounds or 152 rounds, and others are explosively formed projectiles that can literally cut through an entire Humvee. So I'm sure that was a challenging position to be in, to try and mitigate, the
the danger, if you will, of these IEDs all over the road.
Yeah, and EOD covers more than just IEDs. They cover all sorts of explosive hazards from UXOs, which are unexploded ordnance that's left around the battlefield, even from previous wars that took place in southern Iraq, but also things like rockets and mortars that are left on the battlefield or targeting bases. We had a huge role right off the bat because when we entered country and we took over, there was a attack from a rocket-assisted munition that was very damaging, and we ended up providing analysis on that within the first couple of weeks of entering theater, and that analysis ended up making it to the president's desk. So that was something that, as an opportunity for somebody who was a first lieutenant, relatively new to the military, to be able to participate in and add value, was absolutely something that I would have never foreseen being able to take part in.
Yeah, that's something you don't forget either. You know, you do your little slide or you do your analysis and you present it, and now it's on President Bush's desk. You know, that's really cool. That's really cool. Not a lot of stories from the tactical world that soldiers get to, or airmen or whatever, get to say.
And if I could say for a minute that we had an incredible team there too.
Yeah.
My intelligence team was relatively small. It was 5 soldiers, all coming from New York, except for one person who was coming from California, an individual augmentee, and he was our EOD integrator. And that meant that he was an EOD soldier who was not intelligence, but was able to talk to us about the technical aspects of the type of devices that we were conducting intelligence on. Yeah, and that team was just exceptional. They came from all walks of life. They put down their civilian job to pick up this exceptional assignment and really just performed remarkably and was able to provide products that we received direct feedback from soldiers who were on the battlefield, units that were on the battlefield, that they had read our products and that had let them identify a danger zone that had ultimately saved lives of those soldiers.
What a remarkable mission to be a part of, where you can get direct feedback from those on the ground that'll tell you, hey, you know, this stuff, this information, this intelligence that you provided us, you know, allowed us to see this device in this location, and we didn't drive that way, and therefore we lived. You know, what a remarkable thing to be able to say. How did the forensics work? So, like, you know, did you have like a team of Army scientists, or, you know, were you part of the people that went out to the side of the road and figured out what these devices were? Or how did that work?
No, most of these devices were taken care of in the sense that they were rendered safe by explosive ordnance disposal professionals.
Right.
We would not be the ones who would go into the field and recover these devices, but a lot of the analysis from that was sent to a central team. That team would provide results to us that we could then use to analyze where this device might have come from, what group might have been associated with the device, and that would provide us pattern analysis that we could use to try to save lives of people who were traveling on those same routes. And it wasn't without controversy either, because at the time there was a large amount of complicity from the local nation, host nation forces. And to be able to report on that was still something that was controversial at the time. And it was something that ultimately saved lives. We were very proud of the products that we worked on. We did get some negative feedback from time to time that something that we created that predicted based on the complicity of the partnerships that we had at the host nation at the time was something that reflected poorly on them. You know, and that was something that we just had to navigate. Ultimately, the purpose for why we were there was to save the lives of the people who were on those roads and routes. And so that was the most important thing. And at the end of the day, even if what you've been involved in might have been unpopular at the time, if you can exit a deployment and say that you saved lives and that you made the situation better, I think that's the highest calling of an intel professional, is to be able to speak objectively, speak accurately, and speak courageously, even if what you're saying isn't popular at the time.
Yeah, you bring up just an interesting point, because Colonel Tabankin and I were talking in our interview about the challenges of serving in Afghanistan and then watching from afar things kind of go sideways, right? And now you look back and the Taliban is in charge again. They were in charge the day before we got there, and they're now in charge the day after we left. And for some soldiers, and to me included, to some extent, look back as if that, I don't want to say time was wasted, but it's just a challenge to say that I spent so much time and gave up so many resources and damaged, relationships and all these things that happen when you deploy, to just have you go nowhere almost strategically. But, his response was, and what a great way to look at it was, I was given a mission. I went to Afghanistan. I was told that I had to, myself and my team were directed to create an environment that was less dangerous than the one that we entered, and we did that by the time we rotated out, and so therefore I met my mission and I did what I was asked. And so that's the positive you take out of that. And I can see you feeling the same way. Is that the case? Like, even though no matter what's happening in Iraq today, do you get that same sense?
I do. And I joined in 2006, like I said, at the height of the surge. I joined coming from a family that was very supportive of the Iraq War. And then getting on ground and getting to see things personally really changed my opinion about what was going on over there. And, you have discouragements as you see the reality of the situation on the ground, as you see certainly complicity among some of the local population with some of the attacks that are going on. But at the end of the day, like you said, if you're able to walk away from that deployment and say that you made a positive impact in a life-saving mission, that is the most important thing that you can do on an individual level. Many times these geopolitical issues are just way over our heads, and it can be easy to get discouraged or to start to focus on that in a way that's not healthy. But if you were part of a life-saving mission and you were able to make a positive impact, I think that's really what you need to focus on.
So I assume, taking from what you had just said, that if you knew what you know now going into Iraq in 2010, you wouldn't have been as gung-ho in a sense. And I mean that from a strategic perspective, right? I mean, you said your family was very supportive of the Iraq War in the beginning, but is that still the case now, knowing what we know?
Sure.
Today?
Well,
clearly this is just our opinion. We're just talking.
Yeah, of course. So I was, I believe, 13 years old when 9/11 happened.
Oh my
and
God.
Then 15 years old when the Iraq War had really started in earnest. So that really, having been a lifelong New Yorker, having been there and seen the smoke from the 9/11 attacks, you get very swept away with the war rhetoric. And my family was certainly very supportive of the Iraq War as well. And it did have a big impact on my decision to join the military in 2006. My parents, as supportive as they were of what was going on in the military at the time and in the geopolitical realm, were not happy with my decision to join the military, or even my interest in that at the time. Ultimately, they were very supportive. They continued to be a huge support to me in my military career. But at the time, soldiers were coming back in body bags and in horrible conditions. This is 2006. So it was, my parents really struggled with whether to sign the paperwork to have me join at age 17, and ultimately decided to acquiesce and to be supportive of my decision. But at a personal level, I was very convinced of the geopolitics of the Iraq War and the support for it at the time too. And part of that, I think, could be explained by my youth at the time. I was 17 when I joined, but getting to see things on the ground really started to come together with a lot of the things that I had been learning about the war after the fact, after I had joined, and just getting a ground level understanding of what was going on over there. I think I was probably supportive of the war far after you could logically make the argument that we were making a net positive impact. But at the same time, I think as an individual, the best place I could have been was with that unit at that time, at that location, really contributing to a life-saving effort. So I'm not sure I would do anything too different than what I ultimately ended up doing.
Now, to my recollection, there was a large British presence in the south portion of Iraq. Did you get a chance to work with the Brits closely?
Yeah, at the time that we went there, they had mostly withdrawn, but there was still a little bit of a British contractor presence on the base. And it was known that there was a little British bakery still operating at the combined operating base Basra. And that was a special treat to go to take some time off from the busyness of a 12 or 16-hour day and be able to enjoy that.
Interesting. And the Brits aren't known for their food, so that's
No.
you're looking forward to some British baked goods. But did you have a Cool Beans like we all did, the coffee shop?
Oh yeah.
Those?
We definitely did. I will say that I had an unhealthy addiction to a particular energy drink. I'm not sure if we can mention the brand on this show, but it came to the attention of my Intel team that I was perhaps having more of these energy drinks than was healthy for me. So they staged an intervention and stopped collecting the drinks for me because you were only allowed 2 at the chow hall.
Right.
So there was a period of time in which I told my Intel collection team that they were in fact an energy drink collection team and that their job was to bring me back these energy drinks so that they can continue to fuel my energy levels and my intelligence production. And they staged a little bit of an intervention and said that they were cutting me off. And ultimately, I think that was probably the healthiest thing.
Good. Did you go through withdrawals?
I did. Yeah.
Anybody who's deployed, you don't even have to go look up what the energy drink is. You know, but for those who haven't, just Google it. Everybody knows what it is. But
yes.
What about the old near beer? Did you get into the near beer? Did they have that while you were there?
No, that wasn't so much an interest of mine. It was definitely more of the energy drinks, but they did have it, and I know there was many people who enjoyed it.
Yeah, I had Beck's when I was in Afghanistan. So
yeah, I was 20 at the time, John, when I deployed. So
true.
Yeah, I hadn't even acquired a taste for real beer. Never mind near beer.
Yeah. Well, and it's probably a good thing because you would have lost all taste for real beer if you had near beer first. So knowing that you spent some time down there in Basra in 2010, so this would be post-elections. We were there in 2005, the 42nd Infantry Division there was 2005 when they were writing the Constitution and having the first set of elections. So I think Iraq is still in a time strategically where they're trying to get their government solidified, in place, operational, effective, that kind of thing. So, but looking back on all of that now, how do you see what's happening today? Do you think that they're on a, and again, just based on your personal experience, do you think what you know today they're on a path forward? Do you think that they are where you would expect them to be, a young democracy like they are? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so at the point of my deployment was the quote-unquote withdrawal from Iraq, right? So 2010, 2011, President Obama at the time had announced that we were pulling out of Iraq. So that process had started to begin. You had started to see some of the larger formations leaving, and that made it even more important that they had good information about the routes and about IEDs and explosives and things of that nature because there was just a lot of movement along those routes and the units had to be informed about the dangers that were going on there. So that's the period of time in which I was deployed. And yeah, at the time, the biggest threat, especially in the South, was from the Iranian-backed militias. And I would say probably upwards of 90% of our reporting and analysis had to do with these Iranian-backed militias, particularly the explosively formed penetrators, the EFPs, these copper-made EFPs that were coming out of Iran at the time. And that was a little bit, in hindsight, an interesting thing because we ended up partnering with a lot of these same militias when it came to the fight against ISIS. So now looking back on this and seeing, it's a little disorienting to see, hey, this was like the number one enemy that you were there, to really deal with. And then, only a few years later, maybe 5 or 6 years later, America forming partnerships temporarily with some of these units that clearly had American blood on their hands. And, that's the nature of politics. It's the nature of war, is that these things can change quickly. But that was certainly an interesting perspective to have looking back on the country of Iraq. And then, of course, the period of time after the withdrawal was characterized by the rise of ISIS. We certainly felt the effects of that domestically. If you were in the National Guard at the time, there was certainly a spike in even homegrown extremists who were aligned with ISIS. So I continued to keep track of what was going on in Iraq at the time. And I think they're largely doing as you would expect for a nation that's gone through some pretty traumatic experiences with an invasion in 2003, with a continued, I would say it meets the definition of a civil war for many years, and then the withdrawal of a force that was essentially occupying the country, and then reoccupation and another near civil war experience. So I would say, given all those things, are doing probably as good as one could hope for. A lot of the rifts that made the Iraq deployments so challenging for the American military still continue to be there. But if you look at some of the research that's being done on the populace and how they're doing and how their lives have changed, you can see that there are improvements being made now that there's less of an American military presence there. There are some objective measurements of how the average life of the Iraqi is improving. So there are some good things to certainly look to and some encouraging things, but a lot of the same rifts that come about from a nation with very artificially drawn borders and having a lot of religious minorities and ethnic minority sects in the country will continue to be a challenge for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, what do you say to those people who say we wouldn't have any of these challenges if we didn't go in the first place?
Well, I mean, there's certainly some truth to that. You can look at the way in which once we have intervened in these countries militarily, I'm thinking of Iraq, Syria, Libya, other countries as well, that the removal of dictators adds a large amount of chaos to the country. And that certainly is not to say that those dictatorships were in any way good or this was a great situation to begin with, but you look at the chaos that follows, and it certainly should give any serious thinker pause now looking back at the events that had happened in those countries before advocating for doing that again. I would say, if there's any lessons to be taken away, we really need to do a hard look before doing anything like that again in terms of intervention in a country where there's no clear replacement for that power structure. I think even if you do have a plan, it can still go awry, right? We're historically not great at second and third order effects and being able to predict what is going to happen as a result of our military action. And that's way above my pay grade. It's just something that I'm looking at as a casual observer of the human condition and geopolitics, politics, and being able to just look at a situation and say, man, I hope we don't do that again. And hopefully at least not in the exact same way.
Yeah. Where do you stand on the side of, of the question, of the debate, if you will, that, there are benefits, things are better in Iraq, as you had mentioned, in some ways, but are us being the United States attempting to install a version of government/society that's Western based is just not feasible for that part of the world? Or is that an ignorant/short-sighted view, or is it not even relevant? How do you see that?
No, I do believe it's relevant. I think we tend to overestimate the amount of change that we can make and the period of time in which it takes to make that change. I think if the argument could be made for any place in the world to have been receptive to American forms of government and American political values, you would have thought that it would have done relatively well in a country like Iraq, where there was at least an educated population, a somewhat westernized population, a population that had had interaction with the ideas of modernity and the Enlightenment. Certainly was not like America in every sense, but had some advantages over a place like Afghanistan, for example.
Sure, Baghdad was a pretty metropolitan city.
Yeah,
given comparatively.
So given those things, you would assume that it would have gone better than it did, based on our kind of optimistic assumptions going into it. So, I think we tend to assume, like all humans do, that all other humans are like us, and there's many ways in which that's always true. And then there's many ways in which we underestimate our differences and how quickly change can happen.
What would you say is the thinking back to your year that you were there, do you remember a time, or do you remember something that was occurring that you thought to yourself, boy, we're just not doing this the right way? Whether it was something very tactical, like how we drove on the road, or something strategic. Do you remember thinking that to yourself? Like, boy, if we just did this instead of that, we might be making a lot more progress. When I say progress, I mean, quelling the violence and whatever, for Iraq.
Yeah, as having been somebody who had to interact in an analytical sense with the complicity of the Iraqi military and the Iraqi police force on a daily basis, that was the most jarring to me, because these had been people who, at least at a certain level, we trusted and we had interactions with and trained, and this was going to be the future of the military for the country. And that was probably the most jarring experience, was to see the level of complicity that had happened with that particular force in Iraq. And having to look at that every single day in and day out, you're just confronted by the reality of it on a daily basis. So you really couldn't shelter yourself mentally from the fact that there was something very different between what was being projected in terms of how feasible it was for them to accept the values that we espouse and what was actually happening on the ground. The level of corruption continues to this day to be one of the most corrupt the places in the world. The Iraqis' own perception of corruption in terms of their government is very high. I think it's upwards of 80% of Iraqis would say that their government is corrupt, fundamentally in a way that is very impactful for them. That was definitely one aspect of what we looked at that made a profound impact on the way that I thought about the ideas of nation building and replacing dictatorships and military intervention, and perhaps a little bit of humility in terms of what we can accomplish even with the best funded and the greatest military in the world.
I'm of the belief, and I'm in the camp, I should say, of those that believe the decision that stemmed from Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz to eliminate the Ba'ath Party after the invasion was the greatest strategic mistake we made in Iraq. Is that something you agree with, or do you think that it's not the case?
That's a good question. I think we would have encountered a lot of the same challenges even if we had kept the military in place, although I do agree that that was a destabilizing factor. I think if you look at, and this is certainly something that I found out about only years after my deployment, but looked at the history of where the ideas came into being for the invasion of Iraq and how early that had been something that was desired by members of the Bush administration at the time. You just see how naive the assumptions are. They're not even close to what ended up being the reality of the situation on the ground. And this is not something that's in the realm of conspiracy theory. This is something that was written about in memorandums and reports way ahead of the Bush years. And then those individuals ended up in the Bush administration. And they were arguing for going into Iraq before we even knew that the events of 9/11 had concluded for the day. We didn't even know if there were still more attacks or what was going on, never mind who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Those individuals in that administration advocated for going into Iraq. And again, you can read their writings on it at the time, what their assumptions were, why they thought it would be a good idea, why would it be in America's best interest. And so you can make your own decision as to, how well supported those ideas were, or, to the extent to which there was a lot of preconceptions that just turned out to not be true, and how responsible you think those people are for the decisions that they ultimately ended up contributing to.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I ask you that question is I like to think about a parallel universe and whether the decisions we made, if they were different, if we would have been quote unquote more successful. So what, for example, there was a lot of debate in the beginning of the Iraq invasion as to how many forces we would need in order to conduct an effective counterinsurgency campaign, knowing full well we would probably have an insurgency post-invasion.
Sure.
And Colin Powell, for example, his belief was 500,000 or more. That was what they used relatively closely, approximately, to Desert Storm. And there was a general, Eric Shinseki, who also believed that a monstrous force was needed. And I say monstrous meaning, 500,000-600,000 would be needed in order to conduct an effective counterinsurgency. But there was a belief, particularly from Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, that the military, Army in particular, needed to be lighter and faster, and there was no real need to have so many forces on the ground. Now, what am I tying this all into is if we were to have gone in with 500,000-600,000, if we did not eliminate the Ba'ath Party, if Abu Ghraib and that disaster didn't happen, I wonder if things would have been different. Meaning the concept, the optimistic concepts that the Bush administration had would have potentially been foreseen if things worked out a little differently. I wonder if that's the case, or if it was inevitable. We got into Iraq, and no matter how we did it and who went in there and how well trained we were and whatever it is, that we'd still be in the same place.
Yeah,
I think about that sometimes.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some decisions that you can look to and say, wow, this was counterproductive. This was not a good decision, or we could have done this better. But then you look across the globe and you see, has this ever really been done great? Has this even been done decently, where we don't have second and third order effects that are just devastating? It's not immediately apparent to me that if we introduce 500,000 troops to Iraq that we would have gotten less civilian casualties, for example, right? The civilian casualties are numbered somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million potentially. Maybe those are high-end numbers, but that's at least the numbers that are thrown around. So what effect would that have had on the civilian population? It's completely up for debate, but I'm not convinced.
Sure, and I like to not only think about if decisions were different, in particular with Iraq, but how that compares to what we were doing in Afghanistan as well. And so I happen to be one that says I think that we could have a logical discussion as to whether our decisions, the decisions of the international community, if they were different, things may have been different in Iraq. But I think the intent for Afghanistan, whether well-meaning or not, was impossible. Those that didn't pay that much close attention because they had other things going on in their life to these two wars during the time, I don't think realize the vast difference between Iraq and Afghanistan. It is, if you look at both countries, Iraq, as you had mentioned, Baghdad was a very populous and metropolitan city. They had a very strong political structure, even though there was just kind of the Ba'ath Party, but there were some other parties. They had international trade. They had a lot of things going for Iraq at the time, minus the fact that Saddam was crazy and so were his sons. His sons were more crazy than really him. But nonetheless, Afghanistan really had nothing. I mean, I've been to Kabul. First of all, Kabul is like, I don't even know how to explain it. It's like it's really the only population center with any structure whatsoever, any concrete on the roads. And then when you it's just built up on the side of this hill in a valley, and it just, even from flying in on a helicopter, it looks almost kind of like a shanty town, really. I mean, it has no equal comparison whatsoever to Baghdad. And then forget it. Once you get outside of Kabul, it's just forget it. There's just very little there. And I don't think that anything we did, no matter how many soldiers we brought, how perfect we were in our decision making, that Afghanistan would have been anywhere close to what Iraq could potentially be. Now, that may be the case in 500 years, but the tradition and the history and the social history and the cultural history of Afghanistan just doesn't match. It's just not a nation in any sense of the word. It never has been. And the people in Kabul understand Kabul. The people in Kandahar understand Kandahar. The people in the Uzbeks in the north. And it's true that there were significant numbers of Afghans when the United States went in early '01 November, they had never seen Westerners before ever. That's not the case in Iraq. I mean, Iraq had TV, and there were a couple of people in Kabul had a TV, but that's, comparatively, that's it.
Sure.
But the irony of that, in my mind, is that Afghanistan, in a sense, was the more righteous of wars because you could directly connect the Taliban using their concept of Pashtunwali and giving space and protection to Al-Qaeda, knowing full well that Al-Qaeda was directly responsible for 9/11, and that was not the case in Iraq, that at least there was a virtue to removing the Taliban, and outside of all of the other things like hanging people on soccer fields and all the nasty things that they do to women and the rest of it. But whether the initial invasion is righteous or not, the end state was nearly impossible. I mean, I would argue it was impossible. But Iraq doesn't have that righteous connection to 9/11, but potentially could turn out to be a better place 20, 50 years from now. When I say better, I mean more Western, a little more wealthy, and just a better way of life for the people that live there and whatever life they choose. But
sure. And I think one of the heartbreaking similarities between the two wars, and again, I'm talking to this as just Stephen Totter, not in my military capacity, but one of the heartbreaking things was, I'm not sure, are you familiar with the Afghan papers?
I am.
Okay. So, rotation after rotation coming through the country saying, hey, things are getting better, things are improving, we're making a big difference. But then privately saying, hey, this is a disaster. We really don't have any idea how to achieve success. Things are not moving in a positive direction. And that was common between both wars, although it was emphasized more in the Afghan papers, which came out, I believe 2018 or 2019. But you wonder in such an environment whether there could be any success possible, no matter what we change tactically or operationally in the country.
Yeah. I can say from a personal perspective, again, I spent 9 months of my life there, and I was working on a very, very small, comparatively small task force, no more than 50 to 60 people, but had a very strategic mission in attempting to separate the funding for the insurgency and its connections to the narcotics trade. So I had some direct connection, at least through intelligence summaries and briefings and other things, to NATO headquarters. And what I can say is everybody worked their tail off to do the best that they could for the mission they were given, whatever that mission was.
Yes.
Right? Protecting the roads, or whether it was the Germans trying to teach Afghans to be police officers, or whether it was the counter-corruption teams that were trying to teach Western values, and whatever it was, everybody was working really, really hard.
Sure, and in that sense, it's all the more heartbreaking, right? Because you have the youth of the United States, in some ways the best and the brightest, people who had truly given their lives and put their lives on the line to contribute to making the world a better place, to supporting America, to supporting the country, and being able to contribute all their effort, all their attention, all their time for periods of time to an effort that many of the people knew was not working, but was extended by virtue of the fact that those people did not speak up. And there's a good connection there to military intelligence in that I think what's valued most, at least by me, and I'm sure by all good commanders in a military intelligence officer, is the ability to be dispassionate, but to also speak courageously and to say something is working or something is not working, regardless of the consequences for that.
Yeah, I did an interview the other day on the military aspects of weather, and one of the questions that the interviewer asked of me almost numerous times, but in different ways, was something related to just that. Like, how do you deal with presenting bad information to the commanders, knowing full well it might make them upset? And that conversation was, how do you present bad weather or the inability to do certain operations because it's too cloudy out or whatever? I mean, that's just a microcosm of what you're saying. But yes, it is a challenge within the military, because they also want us to come up in an environment that you do what you're told,
Sure.
right? And
Sure.
you do what you're told very quickly, because if you waste time, people die, right? And then people in our position, meaning more senior officers, find ourselves in a position where we have more nuance, more time and space to think about things and say, you know what, maybe this isn't the best thing, but at the same time, I still work for a general and he's the boss or she's the boss, you know. But what I wanted to say earlier, to give an example, just an anecdote about the difference between Afghanistan and Iraq and how the challenges were different. I got to blur this story a little bit, but let me just say that I was dealing with some individuals that were dealing with locals in Kandahar and Helmand province, and these were your everyday Afghans living their life, doing
Sure.
their thing, farmers, most of them, growing poppy, most of them, and you know, it was explained to me that there's such little education and such little knowledge of anything outside of your little farm in southern Afghanistan with so many people that it was nearly impossible, if you will, to work with these people because they knew nothing, and in any real sense that you would expect. They didn't even know cardinal direction. You couldn't ask them if a house was north of you or south of you. You couldn't. These are foreign concepts to them. They knew their house, their family, their farm, and that's it. And if you brought up any topic outside of that, it was like it came from outer space.
Sure.
And you know, that's not me being critical. I'm not trying, you know, I'm not laughing in any of those things. It's clearly, it's just the life that they have been presented. It's the life that they were living. And, you know, who's to say they should know anything else other than that? But my point is, you'd think you have to have a baseline understanding of more than just that in order for a government-like structure for that the United States was looking to implement in order for you to build a nation state out of that. Now, that's not to say that there weren't brilliant people in Kabul and doctors, and Karzai was a very, very intelligent man. That's not what I mean to say. Of course there are those people. I'm just talking about the general everyday person. And the general everyday person in the United States is pretty damn smart comparatively to the rest of the world, right? Or the non-wealthy world, if you will. And I just don't know how you would get to a place where you develop a nation state ready to deal with the rest of the world, trading partners, politically, whatever it is, when you have such a vast amount of the population who they didn't even see Westerners until the day we went in 2001. I just what a unique place.
That is very frustrating. And I think when you're talking about dealing with a situation like that in the future, I think we have just the highest level of moral culpability at this point before committing forces to something like that, because of the information that we have right now, the tangible results of what we were able to accomplish and what we weren't able to accomplish. That data provides us with moral culpability for doing this again.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
I think it's easy to blame it on, things like the education level of the average Afghan citizen, and this isn't what you're doing. Yeah. I'm just saying from a higher level strategic perspective, to look at all these reasons for why things went wrong or what we could have done better, but the real test of whether we've learned the lessons from these various interventions is going to be how we handle the call to further interventions in the future. Because I guarantee there will be opportunities for America to get involved militarily in the future that look very similar to how the early optimistic days of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan looked at the time.
Have you seen the Taliban on roller skates recently?
I did see.
You see that?
I did see that. I saw them on the little flotation devices heading down the river. It's
I didn't
quite
see
a
the
trip.
flotation. I did see the roller skates though.
Yeah.
They're getting around Kabul on their roller skates, trying to do whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah.
You know? just to bring a little levity to a deep conversation. But all right, so we're coming up. We already passed an hour. This is a really good conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time, Colonel Totter, to talk about Iraq. It's one of my favorite discussions. Obviously, I've been there, you've been there, so we'd like to reminisce a little bit and talk about the implications. And being there really does give you a perspective that you just don't get if you've never been, right? And so I appreciate you coming in and having this conversation with me. And what's great about it is we got into such a good topic on the Iraq piece. We have other things that we were supposed to cover and we didn't cover it. So that means you're going to have to come back and we'll do this again because you have so many good things to talk about. And we can, maybe I'll even slip in a couple topics that I know for a fact you're going to want to argue with me against. And we'll just kind of go at it a little bit. And you'll prove to me that God exists and I'll prove that he doesn't, and we'll solve all the world's problems, right? Funny enough. But thanks again for coming in, sir. I really appreciate it. Spending some time with us today, and I look for you to join us another time in the future.
Sounds good, John. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us this week. I really hope you enjoyed the conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Totter and all the things he had to discuss in terms of his career and what happened when he served in Iraq. As always, you can email me, John Malik at headlinesinhistory.com. Check me out on social, Headlines in History on YouTube, on Instagram, or just head off to the website, headlinesinhistory.com. There, you'll also find my Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the show and you'd like to see this experience grow, you'd like to see the episodes continue, feel free to head over to the Patreon site and click on the donation tier, a couple of bucks a month, and it'll really help me continue to go forward with the show. And as I've been saying for the last couple of weeks, make sure you head off to spanglerforge.com. Great stuff there. Outdoor knives, blacksmith equipment for all of your outdoor needs. spanglerforge.com. Support veterans and New York Army National Guard soldiers. Check out some of the great stuff he has there. Thanks for joining us this week. I appreciate you taking the time, and I look forward to talking to everybody next week.